Okay.
Okay.
We have 10 minutes left of our conference this weekend. This is the opportunity for those on the floor to ask questions for our speakers and to respond to many of the issues that have been raised. We've got about 10 minutes, then we would like the opportunity for people to have a cup of coffee and look at the books. Just to remind you that Juliet Jake's book is on sale, and your and other books as well too. Okay, so any questions from the floor, please? Oh, we're going to start with Domenico, sorry.
This is a small contribution to Danny's presentation, which I found very rich and stimulating. And the point is, you said that T came late in LGBT. And I think that is also because the concept of gender identity was developed quite late. And is the most radical approach, because what it does, which LBG doesn't do, is unlinks the mind and the brain to the body. Because it gives status to an internal perception, which in some sense is no longer linked with the body as we see it. So it's totally contrary to what is a system of natural beliefs or what is familiarity. That's why it's a Copernican revolution in some sense. Because the moment this becomes an identity or a new identity, which can be formulated, it leads to also to be a ramification of unlinking between what is the internal perception, what is the mind, and what is the body. And the possibility then, and this is all the idea of embodiment, that you need to give a body, a concrete body, to an internal perception, which is no longer, at the beginning, was seen as a psychiatric condition, because people want to remain in this, link between mind and body. But the moment you unlink it and say this identity is different, is contrary to what the body is showing or saying, is a very radical and total change the situation, I think, which of course then leads to people's feeling that the body should be given to this identity in a way which, for some of people, is an imperative. This is what lots of trans people used to say. It's not a choice. It's an imperative because you want to give body to an identity which is internally strongly perceived.
Yes, I'll respond very briefly. I kind of disagree with your first point. The notion of gender identity was introduced by John Money, I think, in 1955, and then it was subsequently recuperated by Stoller during the 1960s. So, we've been operating with these, we, as in, mental health care practitioners, activists, etc., for a good 50, 60 years, let's face it. So it's not like the concept of gender identity is that new. As far as your second point is concerned, I think, you hit the nail on the head. And it also explains why people like Judith Butler haven't been terribly vocal about the trans question, because it's something to do with how the whole issue of essentialization, if you want, or embodiment, is now effectively taken out of the body into the psychic realm. So there was a time that, when she wrote Gender Trouble, effectively, that feminist critics were arguing against the essentialization of gender on the basis of the materiality of the body, and Butler's argument is going against that grain. But what you see now is that the essentialization is taken out of the bodily space into the psychic realm. This is not my critique, it's an observation, but I think it does explain as to why Judith Butler has not been terribly vocal. Correct me if I'm wrong, please do, but she's she hasn't really entertained the trans question in any, definitely in not nearly as serious a way as she entertained the other questions to do with embodiment during the mid-1990s.
I have to say something here. This isn't the first time that the work of Judith Butler has been simplified for the purpose of making other arguments. So if I could say that in a courteous way.
Sure. No, you don't have to be courteous. You could.
So, yes, you are misinformed, certainly on the question of taking out the trans figure. And I can refer you to the political work that's been happening over the last decade, in which the trans figure is represented as a figuration of well, different formulations of vulnerability and political coalition and so on and so forth. So that's just a point. I take your point, though, that the earlier work was not concerned with trans, but trenched on these topics on the topic of drag. And Judith Butler is not someone who could set herself up as an advocate in place of trans theorists who also exist and who read Judith Butler, with whom she is in conversation. So there are some...
Because?
If you need to ask that question, I don't even know where to begin to reply, but I'll give it a try.
Sure.
Everything that you said in that yellow slide about what would have to change as a result of noticing that there are trans persons should also be said about noticing that there are racialized persons in all of those contexts. And so there is a fundamental flaw in the argument about the exceptionalism of trans, which you may have been pressing upon. That's point number one. Point number two, you referred in your examples of a kind of pernicious a romanticism of the trans character, or a vowel of trans in terms only of choice, a neoliberalized trans. You consistently referred to examples that have to do with the American campus. Mm-hmm. And with the Canadian human rights debates that have been happening recently about attending the introduction of the new human rights language that's coming into the charters and so on. So I think there is a missing piece here. And it is, what is the advocacy for trans by non-trans persons of multiple descriptions across American campuses? What function is that serving? What is the politics of displacement and appropriation that is going on in the mobilization of a massive political project to resist the neoliberalization of the university, of the future, of education, of desire, of sociality, which is what undergraduate students and graduate students experience every single day, much more intensely than their professors? I am one who constantly complain about having to become a kind of purveyor of McDonald's to the client who's only there passing through for a moment. So you've left this out. And I would say that there are analogies in anti-colonial resistance and post-colonial studies, because that's a field I also work in. So one of the analogies would be, these are persons who are using the language of damage, their damage, in order to activate and achieve some kind of social justice claim. Now, it is very hard, I think, for trans students to be placed in that position. But let's think about why it is that these basically straight, although culturally queer persons who are the other students are advocating for this kind of politics at a moment when gay and lesbian student crisis centers are being defunded, and suicide rates of gay and lesbian and bisexual and inquiring and binary and so on students are rising. That's an important feature. That's part of this political displacement. And the other thing that's happening is that an anti-racist politics is becoming actual. And there is, within the student movements across North America, as incoherent and strange as they are, a declivity between the social justice claims that will be made under the rubric of anti-racism and a kind of entrenchment of, I don't know what to call it, but it's a whiteness that runs the spectrum from supremacy to radicalism, with a lot of neoliberalism in the mix, right? So it's a complicated problem. It's not, in my experience and my read of the scene, it is not the case that we suddenly have an explosion of interest or even reality around trans being. I noticed that you had to light upon, and I'm sympathetic with this, light upon really reactionary kinds of statements, like the psychology professor in Canada who refuses to to call people by what they want to be called by, and so on and so forth. These are very rare. They're very eccentric. They represent an extreme articulation of something. If you're going to make the case that there's a generalized saturation of transness, or that trans is a kind of pinnacle expressing the latest turn in the failures of mass culture, we need more examples, right? There has to be, the Foucault that you were sort of, a little bit mocking, although I don't take it personally, you might actually need to think along those lines and produce the reading of the discourse. So I'll shut up. And I say that, in a very friendly way.
You could have said it in another way,
I'm sure.
Honestly, I don't mind. I honestly don't mind. I honestly mind.
Maybe we should...
We only have enough time for 2 more questions. So I would, if you don't mind, I'd just like to open this up to the floor.
Well, this does feel a little bit like the sort of the classic moment, like when the patient is about to leave the room and they say those things. I feel like we're having a bit of a doorknob moment in the conference, or is there something are there things that it might still not be safe to say, and it's better to kind of go and look at, though it's good to look at the books, but like afterwards, but I wonder why that's happening.
Yeah.
So earlier in the day, I started thinking about the last conference 2 years ago, which was on conflict, and how that had felt a little bit more like this, that I think people recognise as a sort of a parallel process thing, that like, there's going to be conflict in the room, or it was a bit more kind of academic that people were, and I've got this feeling now, but through the conference, this feeling of it really being in the body, in the room, of people presenting and seeing people's hands shaking, talking to people in the breaks, and there being this real physical sense of something, and the feeling that relates to violence against trans people as well, So I wonder about your thoughts about kind of where that feeling comes from and what it means for us doing a conference. And also maybe those moments of laughter in, and was that a sort of a slightly hysterical thing, or the moments of our laughter during the last presentation? Whether there's something violent about that, or also whether to pick up on Juliet's use of the word flippancy earlier, that this has to be quite carefully held by us, but that there is something both potentially violent and punishing in the humour and the lightness and the unlocking of things, but also something liberating. But there's a lot of energy in this, and I wondered about your thoughts about, can things be done with that, about that? Or are we just stuck in this cycle of acting out?
Maybe we can let that sit and resonate as a question and hear from some others. Thank you so much, though. I think you're right to say the transmission of affect is heavy.
That's good.
Hi.
Hi, Jordan.
Hi, Danny. Thanks for the paper. I have a question that's inspired by your paper, but actually I think can be opened up to anyone. When you were talking about the tyranny of choice, you were very careful, as you said in the beginning, not to try and think about psychoanalytically how that impacts trans people or other people in general. And you made this point that the issue with it is that it gives reactionaries the false belief that trans people simply choose their identity like they choose, the contact lenses that they dispose of or whatever. But I'm just wondering, I think there actually is quite a trans charitable thing to say, and that kind of is also more universal, this question of, obviously the tyranny of choice affects all of us and gives us all tremendous anxiety and causes all kinds of psychic symptoms. And I'm kind of interested from clinicians about, what your experience of that is like in terms of the clinical effects of living in neoliberal times, and whether there's a way, in a non-transphobic way, to think about how being put under this need to choose can make the issue of figuring out your gender identity much more complicated, and create a sort of super egoic pressure to make a clear decision. You sort of mentioned it, Danny, when you talked about children perhaps being expected to make a decision before they're ready to. But whether this idea of the tyranny of choice actually might be quite useful for thinking about the problems that trans people and everyone has to face. And whether, I don't know, people have thoughts.
I think someone else should respond.
If I heard well what Danny was presenting, I think we see a sort of banalization of the trans experience when it's presented as a consumeristic choice, like a sort of voluntaristic free will, and you commodify something that has nothing to do with purchasing a new gadget. It is, however, overdetermined by class, not a middle-class person who wants to undergo gender reassignment will have access to medical care that somebody very poor will not. So there are overdeterminations of class. So I think we should not forget that. But there is, I think, a sort of oversimplification in neoliberal discourse that produces, as you said very well, a lot of anxiety. That has been studied by Renata Salek, that the more choices you have, the least capable you are to choose, and that's how you end up buying something and then discarding and buying something new. Otherwise, we would go shopping once in a lifetime and we will be done with it. So I think there is a sort of logic that, in that sense, I think there is a political power in the transgender movement as a point of resistance to that neoliberal discourse, because when you learn about the experience, that's what we hear in the clinic, has nothing to do with it. It has overdeterminations because we are within a certain model of exchange. The analyst has to pay for the session, so we are not outside the real of money, but it's not acquiring a commodity. It's not a commodity consumption at all.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Sorry. No. Please.
Perhaps I can add something to that, which is also sort of fitting into that sort of clinical perspective, and because it touches on something that was there in my presentation. When I spoke about these categories of body modification, and when I was in that category of cosmetic surgery, one person who was close to my thinking, but who hasn't been mentioned all this weekend, is Susie Orbach. Now, Susie Orbach writes and thinks and speaks a lot about the body, and it's pretty well known that Susie Orbach is very, very cynical and very critical about a lot of, I think, women in particular, sort of going for diets, wanting to modify their body and having cosmetic surgery. That argument is very valid in a number of cases. But I think in that case there are two sides to it. There are people who, from a neoliberal perspective, gratuitously make choices that are influenced by body image that are a bad idea. When you work clinically with people who need to make decisions, whether it is about sort of body modification on a kind of a serious scale, or whether it is specifically something like trans surgery, certainly my personal experience, my personal sense is that in most cases people are very, very serious. And the people I know, they're not ones who are flippantly exercising sort of ill-thought-out neoliberal sort of choices, but they are operating very often at a much more serious level. So there is a critique from one side that makes sense, and there is from the other side a possibility that critique is not applicable in many, many individual cases. And what happens in practice, what happens in reality, is a difficult one.
Can I just to add to your very interesting point about race? Because maybe that's... I don't know if you may recall the controversy about Rachel Dolezal last year. And I think that brought to the fore precisely many of the points you made, that in me there was... You remember all, so I don't need to sum it up, but what the outing of Rachel Dolezal was compared, because it happened 2 weeks after Caitlyn Jenner came out, in that Vanity Cover magazine that you were showing before. And there were immediately comparisons in the internet with the transgender experience. And in a way that questioned all our categories. Of course, everybody says race is a constructed category that doesn't have any biological correlate, but gender either, and how one experience could be more genuine than other. And that, I think, in that sense, the model of the transgender experience could help us unravel categories that from someone who believes in racial difference can start questioning. And the debate was ferocious, even from both sides of the debate. Those who would call themselves very liberal facing racial issues were having the most extreme essentialist postures. It was a very interesting moment. And in that sense, I see they are a convergence in questioning all our assumptions about identitary claims. Because one thing is, this is a psychoanalytic encounter, that one thing that the unconscious does is question any identitary claim. In a way, a good analysis eventually produces, at some point in the treatment, close to the end of when the cure is completed, a complete fall of identifications. So I think maybe it would be the idea of how could we unravel assumptions.
Thank you. No, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Unfortunately and inevitably, we have run out of time. We will have to stage the sequel, I guess. And I just wanted to thank lots of people. Thank you to our amazing speakers, both yesterday and today. Yes? Thank you to Ivan, Stefan, the Freud Museum for being fantastic, amazing partners in really making this happen. I want to thank my amazing partners in crime here, Barry for for deftly handling the chair and for all your hard work in preparing. Dorothy for being the skillful casting director of this particular production, and thank you both. And if you want to experience more of the site, then there are leaflets outside publicising upcoming workshops and an introductory course, and of course the training. So there's lots of ways to engage with the site for Contemporary Psychoanalysis. Thank you very much.